let's just keep going over this since Hunter is dodging away from me.
So what makes gender gender? What is gender referring to? Gender, and this is where I'm going to get crucified for this, but I do not care. And if I hear a better argument, I will change my position, okay? But my understanding is that gender refers to how people perceive themselves and behave and express themselves in regards to what is culturally recognized as being masculine, feminine, on that type of spectrum.
Yes. So this is fine so far, though. I would say that he needs to make sure that he needs to make sure that it's not just those things. Like it's a combination of those things, and also a deep-seated feeling that there is some relationship between that and your like core identity. Continuing.
And then you have non-binary individuals who, again, are non-binary. Their gender exists as a gender because it is a rejection of the binary.
Yes, this is true. It is a rejection of the binary. But consider what that means, Hunter. If I reject a binary, it doesn't mean that everything which rejects that binary is the same. Does it? Is everything that rejects a binary the same? No. If I lived in a society with only red and blue in it, and then I was like, hey, you know what? I want to be green, and I want to be purple. It wouldn't make sense to say that green and purple are the same color, even though they both are rejections of the red-blue binary. They're still different. And you want to have language that allows people who reject that binary to differentiate between themselves.
Okay. Of gender, again, in regards to masculine or feminine. This is...
Yes, but it doesn't mean that your gender is just... Your gender being not masculine and not feminine is not the same thing as it being the same as each other. Not X and Y does not mean everything is Z.
This is why non-binary people try to present more androgynous.
Yes, they try to present more androgynous so that people don't, some of them do at least, they try to present more androgynous to, like, challenge the idea that they are masculine or feminine. Or they might try to present, mixed. Or they might try to present, like, any other number of ways. There's not, like, a one-size-fits-all here. There's a ton of different things going on. Hunter.
That is what gender refers to right now. Gender.
So this is like interesting, right? Is because Hunter says that's what gender refers to right now. I mean that alone is really strange to me, because if he says that's what it refers to right now, then it implies he thinks that it could refer to other things at different points in time, right? So if it can refer to other things at different points in time, then how would you ever get to that point if you have people like yourself who are rigidly enforcing the way that it is right now? Like, I don't think that... I hear this kind of argument in relation to a lot of other things, too. Like, that, society thinks X is this way right now, so therefore, if you're identifying with Y, then you're wrong. But how do you think it ever got to the point where society changed the way that it perceived something? It got to that point because people deliberately challenged the idea that there were only the options that society was giving you. That's how it got to that point. And by challenging those people, by saying like, oh, you're not correct, like you're not doing it the way that society wants, you're kind of saying that the way that society has it right now is correct. Why? I don't know. But that is what you're saying. Like, you're saying that it can change, but you like it how society does it right now.
Refers to something. Because if somebody says, I am tree gender, and I say, why are you tree gender? What is different between being tree gender and then just having an interest or being, something you're into? Like, is the car mechanic car gender? No. Interest.
No, Hunter. So, I guess this is here's an analogy, okay? Let's bring up MS Paint. Right? So now imagine we've got at this school, we've got two groups of people, okay? We got the jocks. We got the nerds, okay? Everybody in this school falls into either being a jock and a nerd. Everybody's categorized that way. But then one day, some girl comes along, okay? And this girl, she doesn't like the jocks or the nerds. She goes and hangs out with the jocks. And she's like, you know what? These people suck. I hate them. And then she goes and hangs out with the nerds. Then she's like, well, fuck these guys too. They're like, they're such dorks. I don't like Pokemon, or whatever. And so she decides, you know what? I'm gonna defy this jock nerd binary. Okay? And I'm gonna create Goth. She's the mythical goth girl. She's the first one. She is a goth girl, and she creates it. Within the confines of this school, there was the jock nerd binary. These were the two options. But then she's like, you know what? I'm gonna become a goth instead. She is non-binary with respect to the school social hierarchy, but that doesn't mean she is nothing. It doesn't mean that she doesn't share any characteristics with jocks and nerds, but it also doesn't mean that like she's just interestless. It doesn't mean that she has no interests. It doesn't mean that she has no nothing going on. It just means that what she has going on is different from the jocks and the nerds. And then imagine another person comes along. Ooh, yeah. Right? And this kid, he goes with the jocks and the nerds, and then, he goes hangs out with Goth Girl, but Goth Girl is like depressing and, only wants to listen to alt rock, okay? And this guy's like, you know what? I'm gonna start a theater program at the school. And then boom, the theater kids are born. So there's still the jock nerd binary. But now we have these two other groups. We've got the goth and we got the theater kids. Does that mean that because these two define the binary, that goth and theater kids are the same? Are these two the same thing? Of course not. Of course they're not the same thing. Everybody knows that goths and theater kids are different from one another. And yet, they are still, these two are the only two who are outside of the jock-nerd binary. But that doesn't mean that they're the same thing. They are non-binary with respect to jocks and nerds, but they're still their own thing. And that's what it means to be non-binary, or that's what it can mean to be non-binary, is that you don't have to be just not masculine and not feminine. You can be something else. You can be whatever you want. And Xenogenders, this is where Xenogenders are nice, is because Xenogenders are a way for you to describe what you are more specifically. That's like far from complicating things. Xenogenders actually make things more clear, because it's defining what your gender identity is in relation to something that we already have cultural preconceptions about, okay? So think about, for example, cat gender, okay? Imagine somebody says that they are cat gender. Let's do some audience participation. What are some characteristics of cats? What does it mean for something to be cat-like? So agile, intelligent, adorable, sleepy, sly. I'll just think of some myself as well. Aloof, independent. Nya nya is yeah, like nya nya is a character trait. Clueless but daring. But like, look at all the stuff we came up with, right? We have cultural ideas of what it's like to be a cat. That's not to say that all cats are like this, but we do have like ingrained cultural, like there is a cultural archetype of cat that we have in our head. So what is cat gender? Well, cat gender is saying these traits that you associate with cats or being cat-like, this is what my gender is, you know? Femininity, it has these like set of traits that are associated with it, and masculinity has these set of traits that are associated with it. And, you know, identifying with those as your gender identity is what consists of being that gender. So identifying with these traits is what it means to be cat gender. And that's not to say that like everybody who has these traits is cat gender. It needs to be integrated into your personality. It needs to be like integrated into your self-perception. And crucially, it's not like a prescriptive thing. It's a description of how you feel about yourself. It's a description to make it more understandable to someone else. That's all it means. That's all it means to have a xenogender. It's just being more specific about what your gender identity is than saying that it's not male and not female. There's even more to it. There's even more. Because there are some people, there's some people, okay? Some weirdos out there like me. This is the Achilles heel of Hunter's argument. Because agender people are non-binary. And if Hunter is just going to say that being non-binary consists fully of just rejecting male and female, and he thinks that's all it is, that every non-binary person is the same, that all of them are united by that, but that like that's all it is, then what does he do with agender people? Because agender fit this. But it seems to me also Hunter needs to say that all non-binary people are agender. But clearly not all non-binary people are agender. Many of them have gender expression. They feel like they are something. That there is something to their identity that's beyond just not being a male or a female. And you can talk to non-binary people, and I did when I was like thinking about this a lot, right? Because non-binary people still feel like there is something there, and I don't. But to Hunter, we are just the same thing. Like a non-binary person who has gender, who feels like they are agender, just not man or woman, is the same as somebody who's agender. Even though our experiences with gender are completely different. They are completely and utterly opposed. They are incompatible. So, but Hunter is committed to these being the same thing, because if they're not the same thing, then it undermines his whole argument. Because if non-binary can be something other than agender, then that means xenogenders are valid. That just logically entails. Because a xenogender is just being more specific about what your gender identity is that isn't man or woman. That's all.
Personality, hobbies are different from gender. But if they're different, then gender has to mean something.
I mean, they are different, but they are related, no? Like there is a close association between these things in some ways. There are things that people incorporate about their personality into their gender identity. That is not unheard of. In fact, it's very common.
Then gender must be talking about something.
Yeah, it is talking about something. It's just that it doesn't need to be... It can be how you define yourself and your identity besides being a man or a woman.
And then you'll have people that say, well, I want to abolish gender, so I want to say that everything's gender now. That'll just destroy the word completely, because now gender will be everything. One, then now you've taken away gender from having any explanatory power, which I think is going to be at least detrimental in the short run.
I mean, yeah, that's part of the point, is to like abolish gender, but nobody's thinking that it will happen overnight. You know, like people challenging the gender binary in the short run is not going to destroy it in the short run. The whole point. And like, if your goal is to destroy it, you can't just marginalize these people. There's not going to be just one moment where we snap and gender is gone. It's a process. It's a constant process. And like what you're doing here is just restricting that process.
Second of all, you're doing this the hard way. Why are you now going to try and validate Xenogenders, which is more or less people that just want to be special and try to carve themselves out as being unique and different at the cost of unironically delegitimizing trans people who are currently fighting for their rights?
It's only a delegitimization of trans people if you accept their framing. It doesn't delegitimize trans people if you don't accept the conservative framing of it. Like, ultimately, this is still holding on to essentialism. It's a different kind of essentialism than, like, biological essentialism, but it's more of like a cultural or psychological essentialism that Hunter is holding on to here, where you need to have a gender that is within the socially accepted binary. And if you don't, then, well, you know, you're just trying to get attention and you're not valid, and, you know, you just gotta pick one. Like, it's the exact same logic that the conservatives use. And by adopting this framing, you are conceding the point to them.
I know that sounds like a conservative argument, and it can be used in bad faith, but in this regards, I don't need to deal right now with people on Twitter that are saying, you're transphobic if you don't recognize me as being vampire gender.
You don't need to deal with them. And yet here you are. Here you are. Here you are doing that.
Furthermore, what is gender? It is about your self-perception and your behaviors in regards to what is masculine and feminine.
Yeah, it is. But you can define... It is your self-perception in relation to those things. But you can have things that are different than that. You can have things that are different than that. Because if you're not masculine or feminine, if you don't define yourself with those things, then what are you? What are you? If you're non-binary, doesn't mean that all non-binary things are the same. Not all non-binary people are the same.
So you cannot perceive yourself as a tree. There is no legitimate...
Nobody is perceiving themselves as a tree. Nobody is saying that they are literally a tree. Or maybe there are, but like that's a whole different conversation. Like, being tree gender is not being a tree. We have cultural signifiers for what it means to be a tree. Being sturdy, being dependable, having an old soul, being somebody who outlasts others, being methodical, slow. These kinds of things, like think about the Ents, you know? The Ents in Lord of the Rings, you know, besides them being trees, you know, like basically being trees, they behave tree-like.
They must have decided something by now.
Decided? No. We only just finished saying good morning.
But it's night time already. can't take forever.
Don't be hasty.
Right? Like there are personality signifiers with the Ents that make them seem tree-like, above and beyond them looking like trees. Like, would it be as believable if, like, the tree people were, like, hyper fast and, like, they were zooming everywhere and they talked in, like, this in, like, modern speak or something like that? No, nobody would, like, that would not feel fitting, because we have cultural signifiers for what it means to be tree-like, and that's all it means for one to be tree gender, is that they relate those cultural signifiers to their gender identity.
Perception one can have themselves of being a tree. You can theorize what it would be like to be a tree, but you cannot actually have that internal experience.
Yeah. Traditional cultures/mythologies often used signifiers to express something about a person. Centaurs, Medusa, whatsoever. Yeah, exactly, Karasu. Right? Like Medusa. Like, why were snakes chosen for Medusa? It wasn't just for no reason. Like, the Greeks had cultural signifiers associated with being a snake, you know? And we do now. Like, what do we say when somebody, like, we call people snakes? We say, like, they're manipulative, that they're they're slippery, they're, you know, they get in, like, there are so many things that we have to do with these things.
It's the same way we do, or the same way that trans people do in regards to gender. They don't have that same internal perception. And then people might say, well... Finally, when a trans woman says they are a woman, they are a woman. If somebody says, I'm tree gender, you are not a tree.
What would you say to the argument that this makes gender identity no different from personality? Well, because not everything in your personality is related to your gender identity. It's whether or not you personally relate those things about yourself to your gender identity, which is, like, linked to your sex. Like, that's all it means. It doesn't mean that, like, everything in your personality is your gender, because I don't, like, nobody feels that way, or at least not, like, girls, you know? If you talk to a girl, not everything in their personality is related to them being a good girl, and not everything in a man's personality is related to them being a man. So it's about your relationship to those aspects of your personality, or your relationship to those aspects about yourself that makes it your gender, as opposed to just your personality.
Because a tree is not referring to a socially constructed gender identity the same way that...
Yes, but a tree still has cultural signifiers associated with it.
Woman or man is. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up at all. And I don't think that my position here is super fucking intense and crazy. Now, it might be to some...
It doesn't seem like it's super intense and crazy to you, because it seems to me like you just don't understand what it means to be non-binary. It doesn't seem... It seems like you just haven't thought very deeply about, like, the implications of being a non-binary person. Like, it just... The reason it seems crazy is because we are socialized to think of these things as cringe. We are socialized to think of these things as deviant, as unnatural, and that they need to have, like, a special justification for themselves. Like, think about that, right? Think about how someone with a xenogender needs to have a special justification for their xenogender, whereas, you know, being a man or a woman, you don't need any special justification for that. It's just assumed that man and woman are, like, existing categories, and that they're sensical categories, and that you can relate to them in some way. You don't need to justify how you relate to them. You can just say that you do. But with a xenogender, you have to, like, go out of your way to, like, make all these arguments.
Dipshits on Twitter, and that's fine. But for the most part, what I'm saying here completely encompasses the validity of trans people and the validity of non-binary people, while also
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It doesn't encompass the validity of non-binary people at all. Your perception here is that non-binary people are all the same gender, or that they just have no gender. But that's clearly not it. It's clearly not it. So it does not actually encompass the validity of a non-binary people at all. Anyway, continuing.
Recognizing that gender cannot simultaneously be nothing and everything while you want to abolish gender. And you're right. Ben Shapiro's
Yeah, you can do that. You can say that it's nothing and everything. Oh shoot, I forgot to switch back to to the other window. Oops.
And you're right. Ben Shapiro's wife identifies as a doctor. That's a good point. So what separates an identity in line with your career as opposed to a gender identity?
Whether or not you relate it back to your self-perception. That it's your relationship to it that makes it a gender identity as opposed to something else. That's all it means. And gender identity relates back to your sex, right? So like we have these concepts of gender, which fuck. I actually hold on. I don't want to go too far into this because I still haven't read enough of the literature to like make a big declarative statement on it. But my understanding is that like, you know, the sex gender distinction comes from like differential roles that were given to people as societies developed. The differential expectations that we developed towards sex as societies like came into being, these things turned into gender roles. And when that happens, you can relate them back to yourself. You know, you can say like, I identify more with this role than that role, or, you know, this aspect than that aspect. Like these things take on an existence of their own, right? They are structures in society, and we can relate to them in a lot of ways. And one way of relating to a structure is to reject it and to relate to something else instead. That is a valid way of relating to the structure.
What makes it different? If you're going to answer that question, you need to have an understanding of what gender refers to. When I say, I identify as a doctor, that means that you have a career and a profession.
Yeah, but this is again the confusion, because you're confusing something like doctor with a gender, which is man or woman. Being a man or a woman consists in identifying with femininity and or masculinity in a specific way. That's what it means to be a man or a woman. That's all it consists in. Being a doctor is something else. But you can be Dr. Gender if you want. Dr. Gender. I am Dr. Gender. Okay, sorry. You know, you can be Dr. Gender if you want, and say that, like, because there are ways that we perceive doctors as well, you know? Depending, like, there are cultural signifiers to doctors. And if you relate to those things as a gender identity, then you might describe yourself as Dr. Gender. Anyway.
Essentially validates your profession as a doctor. But if I say, I'm a woman, I'm a man, I'm non-binary, that's how I identify, what does that mean?
That means that you relate to the structure, like, it means that you relate to femininity and or masculinity in a specific way, as you said. But that's all it consists in. Nobody is saying that that their Dr. Gender makes them a doctor. Nobody is saying that, because they're not a doctor. They're Dr. Gender. Joe Biden's right hand them Dr. Gender.
It means that's referring to your internal perception and identity of yourself.
Yes, in relation to those things. And you can relate, and one valid way of relating to a structure is to relate to something else instead. Say, fuck that structure. I'm going to relate to something else instead in the same way that I would relate to the structure, femininity, and masculinity. That's all.
In regards to masculinity, femininity, or a rejection of both.
All right.